Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thanks all for coming up. Really good to see a good turnout. So we've got a title up there, Cattle Selection and Mob Grazing for Profitability. Talk's going to be a little bit wider than that because there's a lot more in terms of our decision making that's involved in making the whole system work for us. But a bit of background on us. Grew up on the family farm, finished college and worked as a professional ecologist for many years, trying to find lots of ways to make the family farm work, and sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing. And then over the course, came into the family partnership at about 2003. We started off with about 185 acre farm that I grew up on, but when I came back we were down to 50 acres for various reasons. Then slowly built the farm back up over the last few years, and we've just sold some cows actually, so we'll probably have about 90 cows to the bull next year, pedigree Angus, and we also have about 40 pedigree red poll cows as one of the contract farming agreement farms that we have as well. And I'll just get into the presentation, and just to say that the title sounds a bit like you're going to get all the answers. I'm not here to try and give you all the answers. I'm going to talk about what we do and what's worked for us and what's got us to where we are and where we want to go. I've used this slide before. Some of you might have seen this slide last time I was up, but I just think it's a good thing to realise that that we do need to have good stories and good messages around cattle farming at the moment. You know, it almost seems like an endless onslaught of cow bashing sometimes in the media. And I think just to be aware but we do need to tell the stories about that we can do things better. This is in North America where you've got a feedlot operation, and that in the background is not a mountain. Well, it kind of is. It's a mountain of manure. So that is actually a giant pile of manure in the environment, and that's actually on fire for 2 years. That was on fire for 2 years. So when we get people criticising animal agriculture or cattle farming, and they're talking about emissions from cattle farming, these are the kinds of situations that they're talking about. But of course that doesn't relate to our industry in this country. You know, so here's some of our cows, you know, fairly typical scene in British countryside, and you know, the reality is that most of what we do is actually relatively environmentally benign in terms of cattle farming, but we can actually increase the ecological advantages and what we do with that. So a couple of the bulls we've got, and then species-rich grassland that we're grazing most of the time. So nearly all the pasture we graze is species-rich grassland, wildflower meadows. It's quite low production. Some of it's really scrubby, hilly ground up on Breeden Hill. Some big areas we can't get many cows to the acre up there, so we graze what we can and we keep moving. But in terms of how we from the profitability side, how we built the business, you know, when we started with 50 acres, I came from the ecological background, and it wasn't really making that work financially. We were doing conservation grazing with environmental partners, but still wasn't quite adding up. Just trying to make that work. But how we've built it up as well, when we started, we couldn't actually go and borrow money to build the herd up. The bank wouldn't lend to us initially. They wouldn't lend to us to buy breeding cows. They'd only lend to us to buy store cattle. And so that's what we did to start. And it wasn't until we actually found holistic management in about 2012 when I read that first book, and then went to the first course, I think, in 2013, and really started implementing what I found, that we managed to grow it up from 50 to over 1,000 acres. And we've done that on cash flow. And you know, we've built that up through the business, and so that's, you know, so for us it's worked. I'm not saying it's perfect for everybody, but yeah, we bought the store cattle, and then after 2 or 3 years we had a really good sale. The prices moved perfectly for us on the organic trade at the time. I think we were selling for $4.85, $4.95 dead, and sold the fat cattle, went and bought the cows I wanted to buy, and then told the bank, and luckily they were okay with it, so it worked out. And then we've sort of taken it forward from there. And that's the holistic management framework. And the key thing here is having a holistic goal or a holistic context as part of that. And that's a little thing, I'll carry that around with me just to help me make decisions, because the reality is making decisions in the business, there's so many different moving parts, so much going on. It's easy to do things, and I still do it now, that actually are not moving us towards where we want to go. But unless we actually define where we want to go, then we're not going to get there. And I think that's the key thing with having that holistic goal. And in terms of what that means, the holistic goal is not just, it sounds a bit sort of hippie, but all it's about is making sure that your quality of life is also aligned with what you want to do in your business, and then setting out a vision for what that's going to look like. And one of the things that they've actually done in sort of tweaking how they talk about this is, instead of having goals, because then that suggests a destination, in which case what do you do when you get there, it's more about defining a context, like what does your everyday look like and what do you want it to look like. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. Someone said to me, like, you having a goal is like if you've got a favourite book or a really good film, you're not really looking forward to getting to the end of it. It's about the whole process all the way through for your life and life of your family on the farm. I think that's a really important part of it. And it's one of the things that when you do a talk, everyone wants to talk about holistic grazing, mob grazing, or the grazing systems, and that's the thing that interests people. But actually, it's actually making decisions within that framework and knowing what you want your everyday to look like that makes a difference. And why that's important, and it's partly because it makes us actually aim towards something in all our decision making. And if we're not careful, problems will push us around, and they won't be the only thing pushing us around. But we're often reacting to problems, and we're making decisions on the basis of what's happened to us, rather than proactively aiming towards where we want to end up. And it also helps us in terms of having a shared vision within the group. Coming from a family farm, my dad wasn't. He's always been very intensive, and he wasn't sure about the direction we were taking. But actually having clear goals and actually seeing that you're testing yourself against financial targets about where you want to be, and seeing what works and what doesn't gives people confidence. And actually going through the process helps bring people together, because one of the things I quite often get asked about is succession in family farms, and trying to get away from a situation where 90-year-old grandma's still got hold of the checkbook and nothing passes without that signature, because that doesn't help us move the businesses forward. I talked about that context versus goal as well. I think never it's been more the case is if you don't know exactly what you want to do, if you don't have a goal for yourself, then someone will definitely have one for you. And in the best, I don't mean this in a bad way, but Cairngorms National Park probably have a goal for you. The government, who else is there? Which government? And that changes. The wind changes. What's happening with public policy at the moment? Are we going to react to it and say, well, which way is the wind blowing with subsidies? Are they going to pay us to rewild? Or are they going to pay us to do this? So I'll just do that. Is that what you want? And is there a way of marrying what you want with what's on offer in terms of the incentives that are out there? People will be pushing you in those directions. Obviously, the media seem to have an agenda at the moment. We'll be careful not to be pushed around by these sorts of the public access, competing industries, the fake meat industry. They've got agendas for animal agriculture as well. They're going to try and push you around. There's competition for land use where we are. There's huge land use pressures coming from the AD plants. So people growing maize for ADs, putting rents sky high. So there's all these things. If we're not careful and we don't plan for them, we're going to end up not being in control of our destiny. And that's why we need to actually plan properly. We talked a little bit about that already. One of the key things I find is particularly if there's a succession situation, is the new generation coming in just want to sort of cast everything out. And I think the key thing is, and that sort of goes for our partners in nature conservation as well. Obviously, I worked as a professional ecologist for many years, but it's the fact of not trying to have wholesale change, but accepting that the traditions and cultures of people on the land for generations, that's so important. If you throw that away, things never really work. So it's really important that you don't have that new breed mentality. And I think also working with families, and if it's a new direction or a different direction, it's important to understand that when you're saying we can try these things, we can have a more ecological system, we can do things like this for animal welfare, it's not about judgment, it's not about saying that the past was wrong, it's about saying it's just what we did then. There were a different set of goals, there were different, people the government wanted different things, so did the public, so we put that right. And if there's within the family group, within the business, if there's opposition at the start, it's really important to address that so that everyone is getting a voice within the process, so that it doesn't build up problems down the line. And when I'm saying all this, I'm not saying that we do all this perfectly, but it's just about the fact that as long as you keep addressing it and keep doing it imperfectly, but as long as you're talking to people and you're clear about what you want, then that really does help. One of the interesting things about the system is that, I'm very much in the last category, in that it usually takes me about 3 goes to learn something. And so it's, and if I have to learn it that many times, and I'm not actually I'm not the most, as Clem will tell you, I'm not the most organised person in the world. But despite my lack of ability in many areas, I've been able to build a business by trying to make decisions and coming back to this decision-making framework to plan for what's best and actually have that goal in mind, because otherwise, with a bit of a scattered brain, I could be going in all directions. And so that comes back to the process. So you have your goal. We're trying to work with the ecosystems and the water cycles, make them work for us, so that we've got good infiltration, good water storage. So that means the soil's good in really wet weather, but it also means the soil works really well in dry weather, which we probably have a bit more of where we are. The mineral cycle's working in terms of the decomposition and the soil health and the soil organisms, helping grow more grass by creating more fertility. And the key thing is the energy flow. Where are you getting your energy from in your business? Essentially, most of us here are solar farmers, so we are basically just using the sun's energy to grow grass or to grow whatever, to then convert that into meat. And I think when we start buying it, when we've got all that free energy, and we try and do the best we can with that, if you start buying energy in the form of fuel, electric, whatever it is, motive power, whatever, it's just, every time we do that, we've really got to be careful of making sure the return on that different kind of energy is actually bringing the return we want. And just testing yourself on some of these things, because it's quite tempting. I don't own a quad, we cover about 1,000 acres. It's just like, can I justify it? Do I really need it? Can the truck manage? Could I walk a bit extra? Is that going to help me get fitter? And then we look at what tools we've got, question ourselves about our decision making, and then we plan, implement, and we monitor and replan. And with that in mind, trying to put that process to work, why do we make the decisions we make? And I think it's quite easy with social media and regenerative agriculture has suddenly become this bandwagon. It's all the rage. Everyone's talking about it. And it can feel a bit sort of why, and people, you've got to make sure this is actually what you want to do. For me, the ecological approach, that's just something I was really interested straight out of college, became an ecologist. Rugby mates couldn't really understand what on earth I was doing, pulled my leg about it, but it's what I really love. And so that was always going to be an integral part of the business, because it's, almost from a selfish point of view, it's what I enjoy doing. I love seeing the extra orchids we get in the flowers and the wildlife that comes in. That's all part of it. So it's really just something that I enjoy, and that's why we choose it. And I think with social media, like why social media I put up there, it's quite tempting, where you can see people getting swayed by what's getting the most likes, where the next narrative's coming from, what the next thing is, and just to be careful with that. And I find the key thing for us is with social media is try and use it honestly, rather than, I don't know if that's the right word, but try and use it so it's always directed towards a business gain. So it's sort of fairly mercenary in that every action we try and take on social media is actually to try and get a financial return from it. So if we can build a bit more of a brand on our pedigree Angus, then we can maybe sell more bulls, we can sell more females, we can sell more straws of semen, whatever it is. And people understand what we're doing, and if our cattle work for people, then we'll have repeat custom, and if they don't work for people, then we won't be in business very long. And so that's just having that focus just stops the temptations of being swayed towards doing certain things on social media because that's where the likes are, or that's what the posts that get the most promotion and all that sort of stuff. Because it doesn't do my mental health any good, the social media, but just having clarity on it does help me. So why pedigree? So again, these are all decisions we've gone through initially when we started. Partly it's an interest within the family. My father and grandfather bred pedigree livestock for many years. Hill Radnor sheep. They won the Royal Welsh Show a few years with those. Hereford cattle as well. So I was obviously chose Angus, which was obviously the wrong thing. But at least it's something that we share an interest in, that we can work together on. And I think within the family business, the fact that I'd taken a different path than Dad, but then this is something that actually we both really enjoy, looking at those cow families and seeing how the cattle progress, and that side of things. The other thing is, we're doing it mostly on other people's ground, so we're rented ground, so we've got rent to pay, or there's a contract farming agreement, then we've got to share profits, so we need more of it. And so to be able to have something where we can be a price maker rather than a price taker, we're dictating what price we get from the majority of our stock, it gives us a benefit there. You don't have the issue up here. We've never had TB, God willing we won't, but it's an issue down where we are, and if you ever do get it, then the compensation on pedigree livestock is a lot better than it is on the other. So it's making all these decisions to just try and manage your downside risk all the time. And I think that's really important in agriculture because, we're essentially, the amount of times, the model is that, whether it's growing a crop or bringing on a young animal to sell, is, you start the crop, or you plant it, and then you fertilise it, and you've got the field operations, and you've got all these costs are going out the door, and then you harvest it, and then you sell it, and then you just hope to hell that the current price at the commodities at the time is more than what you paid for all the costs. And it's not, for us renting land in that situation, where we don't get all the subsidy, it's not an option to operate like that. So that, again, it all feeds into that. The other thing for us is it fits into our mission really as a business is that, Dad had some very bad luck. It wasn't really his fault, but just had some bad luck at different times in the business. And just the fact that family farms can be really difficult. And I'm really concerned about the direction of the policy on agriculture and family farming and the risks to potential future family farms. I don't think the conservationist job's going to be easier in a more corporate landscape. I think the family farms are absolutely key to conserving our biodiversity. These families have lived there for a long time. They've been stewards of the landscape for generations and generally done what they've been asked by the government in order to deliver, whether that was food production, if that was the main goal of the time. And I just feel a little bit at the moment that think they're being thrown under the bus. And so part of our mission, if we can find profitable systems that also have a good story around the environment, deliver for the environment, and potentially keep our family farms and therefore our rural communities together, then that's trying to get your sort of triple bottom line, so you're positively, having a positive impact financially for your own family and your own bank account, and then socially your own community, and then environmentally as well, and make sure you're hitting all of those things. The brand side of it, so having a pedigree herd allows us to have something to sell that's about us rather than just where the farm is, because we're on a mixture of 5-10 year farming agreements, so we don't necessarily have that security of tenure. So we make those decision to have something that we can then take with us if we had to move somewhere else. It's a brand that people understand how we manage, what our stock are about, and again, so these are all decisions that have come from the decision making process. And then the other side of it is, because we've got more revenue from the pedigree side, it means we get to employ people, perhaps we get a bit more help from that point of view, and I enjoy working with the team, and that gives us a bit more quality of life in terms of time off and weekends off rather than if you're a one-man band. But also we're selling to people who are managing their land and cattle in the same way, and we're now sort of putting together a bit of a breeding group who've got the same sort of breeding principles, and meet up, have a beer, have a chat about what we're doing, compare notes, share bulls, do whatever. But it's that people side of enjoying what you do, the kind of thing you might have had from a show circuit or a sales circuit, in other breeds that we don't perhaps have in the regenerative agriculture side of things. And then from our sales of semen straws as well, that was another decision. We've got the risk of TB. It's potential other revenue that gives us something to sell if everything got closed down. Again, we've never had TB ever, and God willing we won't. But it just gives us a bit more flexibility, and it also allows us to keep our genetics longer. And if we've got some really good performers, it allows us to come back to them in the future and make sure they're not lost to us. And that's part of all of that really comes down to, we've got to a point where I've got one full-time member of staff, Dad's stepping out, doing less and less, he's just 70. And so having a business big enough that we've got a full-time employee, we can share weekends, every other weekends, you actually get to have a holiday. I mean, it seems like little things, but, I've got mates in dairying and others that they never have a day off. There's a lot of family strain, there's a lot of family breakup. And there's a lot of mental health problems in agriculture. It's one of the worst sectors. Lost a cousin to suicide. It's we've really got to look at this stuff. It's easy just to throw it away and say, oh, this is all, it's all a load of nonsense. But the reality is there's some really big issues within our sector that we need to grow up and address, and not have this idea that, if you're not working all hours, then you're not farming properly. You need to have balance. I think there was more time to chat over the fence in the past than there is now, and I think we need to get back to try and find some more of that time. Just to see what our quality of life goals are as well. So these are all things you might be considering, and they're all things that could be something you want to do. And I think the key thing is, and particularly with regenerative agriculture, is there's a lot of options, and people get excited. And I don't do a lot of consultancy, but you sometimes get a call now and again, and someone's decided they're going to transition the whole farm, and they're going to, let's say it was a dairy, they got rid of the cows, they're letting the ground at the moment, and what they're going to do next year is they have a new cattle herd, they're going to have sheep, they're going to have pigs, they're going to have chickens, and they're going to rotate everything all together. They're going to put some nut trees in all the fields, too close to the gateways, and too close to the hedges, so you can't trim the hedges. But it's like everything, we're going to do everything because we can, and then we're going to have a firewood system, and we're going to have this and that. And it might just be an idea, just to do a bit of planning, think about how many of those actually you want to do, and which ones of them are the ones that are going to get you closer to that context of what your everyday looks like. I think that's really important, because I can just see a lot of people going to fall over if they're not careful. And that's the thing is, you are the expert on your farm. Every farm's different. You see a lot of arguments on Twitter about some people decide, we think this is what you should be doing farming, or you should be doing this, you should be doing that. But the reality is, every situation is different. Every land tenure is different. The amount of productivity is different. The drainage on the land is different. All of that stuff. So the key thing is making sure that's why your holistic goal is relevant to your situation. So you're not having to look over the fence, benchmarking against someone with a completely different setup. I don't think that's a useful thing for us. So just compete with yourself rather than anyone else, really. Take yourself to what you want to do. And then hopefully you tick all those boxes as you move forward. And then the key thing is, coming back to the peeing on the fence earlier, is that assume you're wrong. And that's something that some people can find difficult, but it's having an assumption that you're wrong actually helps, because it leaves you more open to the possibility that things could, that you might need to do something else. It's easy for us to go down one route and think we must be right on this, and then won't let go because you've got too much, put into it, and that doesn't allow you to do this process effectively because you're always going to be biased. It's one of my weaknesses, to be honest. And then come back to that. So that's just to say that holistic management, it's well worth looking at, and a lot of it actually reads, when you look at the book, it reads like the old agricultural management textbooks that you might have had at college or university. There's a lot of the stuff is the same, but it's just a really good system to look at. I recommend it. And if there's going to be more training on this sort of stuff in the future that might be run up here, then definitely take note of it. It's all really useful stuff, and the more I've come back to it, the more it's had positive impact on our business. So that's the boring bit out of the way. Some of it can be a bit dry. So we talk now a little bit about grazing practices. I won't go into too much detail. I did a fair bit on this last time I came up. And then we'll look at some of the cattle breeding decisions we're making, and then we'll look at some of the how the grazing systems are impacting us and how we save a bit of money over wintering and make those decisions. So I love that quote. But the key thing for me is the fact that, you know, there were a hell of a lot of large herbivores in prehistory, and the environment itself provided a living for those animals on an annual basis. They were just, you know, and we've essentially, if we can just mimic the natural systems that, you know, that kept all these buffalo or bison going, you know, that we actually haven't topped the stocking rate that they had in America prehistory with what we're doing. Even with all the corn growing and growing the soya and growing the maize and whatever to feed them, we still haven't got as many animals, even if you look at all the acres that go to feed the animals and everything. So, you know, I think that's tremendously positive and hopeful that we can actually increase our beef production in the world and still be sustainable. You know, and obviously these animals had to go through the winter, so how did they survive? We'll have a little bit of a look at that. And one of the key things that we use, it's a fairly basic concept used in New Zealand three-leaf grazing, but also used in mob grazing, holistic grazing, is the principle of rest. And the key thing for me on that is that the physiology of the plant is that it evolved with the grazing animal. So it's had to get ready to be grazed to evolve into that situation. And so because it grows its green leaf, it knows that's at risk. It knows, but you know what I mean. It gets grazed off, but it's kept some energy stores in its roots and crown of the plant, ready to regrow. And so then that regrows out enough, say about 4 to 6 inches, to give it enough of a leaf that the sun can then take over, providing the energy source, and then grow the rest of the grass plant up. The key thing is if we're particularly in an organic system where we can't just provide the energy through field amendments, we're in a situation where if we graze that plant off again before it's had a chance to regrow and put the energy back in the roots and crown, then it just doesn't have it there, and you increase the recovery time and therefore decrease your productivity by about 18 to 21 days. Research has shown if you regraze at that point, so you can be waiting that much extra days just to get to the same regrowth point if you regraze, and that usually means that you've got an occupation period of not more than 4 days. Now, it said mob grazing on the title of the talk. I don't know if that's necessary. That's kind of a catch-all term in this country, but it's quite a specific term in America where it really means high-density grazing and regular moves, very, very regular moves. And we've done everything from moving 3 or 4 times a day, moving every day, moving every other day. And to be honest, when you're employing staff and you're having to work out what they're doing with their day all the time, if you factor in the labour cost to the extra productivity, you get the difference between moving, say, or not moving, having set stocking, and then getting to move them within that 4-day period, so they're never on a patch of land more than 4 days. The additional benefits of going to every other day or every day, or 3 or 4 times a day, just for us, might work for you if you trial it, but they haven't shown a return on the extra labour cost of doing that. And so we've settled of moving Fridays and Mondays to keep it simple. That keeps things easy for stock checks on weekends as well, so there's no big jobs to do. And it means that we can actually plan our weeks a bit better. working on the business rather than working in the business, and just put a bit more time in that way. So that, for all of those reasons, that's where we've ended up. But the key thing is not regrazing it. And where we do regraze, it has a negative impact on us, and we get much less regrowth. And then that, just doing that, say if we get it wrong in May, then that means the energy stores and the regrowth potential of that plant right through into the winter, so our winter stockpile, what we'll be going into as soon as we hit dawn. You can see here that we're grazing into right through the flowering period. So as an ecologist, I used to butt up against other ecologists who'd say they'd have exclusion periods for flowering periods. And so I guess this comes down to trust a little bit. So if you just turn stock into a field that's flowering and you leave them there and you say, oh, it's all right, we're doing mob grazing. So you know, if you want this to work for you, you're going to have to build trust. But what we try and do is move them on as quick as we can. So we're leaving a lot of forage behind. So this is me coming for a move with these fattening cattle here. And you can see we're leaving, actually, you can see there's a lot of flower heads left behind. There's still really good density of flower heads. They're all going to drop seed. But the other thing that happens is that where the bits that have been grazed, because we've left most of the rest of the plants here, they'll actually grow additional flower heads, which will then keep flowering into August, September, even we'll have them flowering in November. So we actually stagger the flowering season, which is better for invertebrates, rather than a hay crop, which might be taken July or whatever, and then that's it for inverts for the rest of the season, for invertebrates and butterflies. And so actually, the fact that these systems allow us to keep stock outside longer, providing longer periods of flowering plants, these are all benefits, I think, that why we should be able to not have exclusion periods. So do explore with your agency staff, or if you've got stewardship type agreements, then agri-environment schemes, then if the rules on the grazing say you can't do it, then just address it and talk to people, because often you can get things changed. I'm not sure of the system up here, but some of that might be applicable. Just ignore the words, but if we're looking at the grazing regraze, so if that's the plant waiting to be grazed, then it gets grazed. Now, because it's got the energy in the roots and crown here, as a rule of thumb, it doesn't then deplete its root source. It doesn't kill this off. But if you regraze, it's got to get the energy from somewhere. And so what it does, it'll actually kill off part of its root mass in order to then regrow the plant enough for solar energy to take over. And the problem with that, you can see how much root mass you lose. For us, we're wintering on quite heavy clay. So whilst we might average 27 inches of rainfall a year, some years we'll get 65, 70, and some years we'll just get that in the winter. And so it's been so variable, and we've had to cope with that. But wintering on ground with root mass like that is a different world to this. That'll take a hoof so much better. The ground stays drier. You're going to have much quicker build-up of organic matter, which is going to store, I can't remember the figures of how much extra water it stores, but it stores a hell of a lot more water before things get saturated. And if the soil doesn't get saturated as soon as in the winter periods, then that means the soil stays alive longer, so the soil stays warm, because it hasn't become anaerobic, because it's become saturated. And if the soil's alive and warm, then that means your growing season on the grass extends at the shoulders of the year, both at the end of the winter and into the spring as well. And so looking after this is really important. And the other thing that we find is that if you allow the more or less the above ground biomass up there is more or less the same as the below ground biomass with grasses, it seems to work out. That's pretty consistent. And so if you only let them get to this point up here, then you're never going to be growing the root mass. So you're going to have the longer rest periods that allow the grasses to grow up and seed, but that also happens to allow all the wildflowers to flower and to increase and seed and as you go on. So it's really important to consider how your management is affecting actually the soil. And we're on heavy clay. We've got 12 foot of Evesham Series 2. It's lias clay. It's very sticky yellow stuff. But we'll have 12 to 14 inches of topsoil on the top, built solely by roots. and places we're at sort of getting up for 17-18% organic matter in the best places. So, you know, you can really have a big impact, a huge amount of carbon in there as well. So that's just what I was saying about whatever above and below ground biomass is likely to be. And that's just to look at potentially a set stocking environment where if they're selective grazing, then they're going to be leaving what they don't like. So that could be some rushes, it could be weeds or whatever, but there's no competition in the deep root zone. They're getting all those minerals for free. And they're going to be seeding into quite an open seed bed as well with set stocking, so then you bring on the weed problems as well. And so forbs or herbs, they tend not to grow from the base, they're tending from the leaf tips. They grow from the leaf tips, so the impact of regrazing is actually often more on herbs. And so continuous grazing, and I know there's some people in ecology think it's okay to continuous graze, but I think the reality is it's a lot more stressful for those herbs. And we find that you get far more diversity if you do, if you have short duration and keep moving. In terms of wildlife, we get incredible orchids right across the farm, and they just increase every year, and we're just getting more and more. And I think that's partly down to the soil biology and particularly the fungal associations, because every different species of orchid, I think we've got pyramidal, common spotted, southern marsh orchid, bee orchids, and there's some ragged robin down there. So that each one's got its own mycorrhizal fungi that has an association with each different orchid, and so you need this diversity of different kinds of fungi, and over time we seem to be getting that. And interestingly, seeing broom rape, which is I think, is it saproxylic the right word? So that's the one that, so it doesn't have any chlorophyll. You can see it's just completely brown because it lives off the decaying matter that's breaking down into the soil. So if you've got good trampling and you've got a good amount of soil coverage and what some people might call wastage, but actually that's feeding the soil, giving you fertility, and species like broom rape are actually speeding up that process. And when you see those start to come in, we're getting all these species that actually in a lot of grasslands are absent, and they might be actually keystone species for getting that whole soil nutrition mineral cycle going. And if you don't have them, you don't get the momentum that you need in terms of that improvement. So you can see there's a lot of green-winged orchids here. They've just gone bananas. But we've also got, I think that's dropwort. Is that some quaking grass here? We've got some saxifrage, some meadow saxifrage. So some really nice species. Short-eared owls, grey partridge turned up. We've got shrike coming on the voles. We get little egrets that started following cattle coming in. And that's quite common actually now. It's becoming more common, especially on mob grazed grass where there's a lot of tall grass about. You're getting a lot of these waders and stuff coming in. And I think as we get to critical mass, as more and more farms do this, it's going to really increase quickly, which is great. Barn owls coming straight away. Starlings following the cattle all the time. Believe it or not, they're actually on the red list. You know, in terms of conservation concern. Really fat kestrels. The kids call that the fattest kestrel in Worcestershire, and literally will follow the van. So if I turn up in the truck in the morning, or whenever to move them, the kestrel just hops along, follows you. Because when you put the cows into a new break, and they go in, and because there's such big vole populations because of all the grass that's there, you could say they're eating all the grass, but it comes out the other end and fertilises too. But they'll come and literally pop down 4 or 5 times in the next sort of 10-15 minutes, and they've had 4 or 5 voles, and that's them done for the day. Stone chats overwintering. And you know, it's just nice to see all the wildlife there, and to be able to show people who come around. In terms of the business performance or the stock performance, so when we finish cattle, we've done it all off grass by 28 months. So average, so all under 30 months. And so we were buying stores in at 15 to 17 months in the autumn, and we're basically running them through almost 12 months, finishing them off through the summer. And one of the things that you saw, and I showed us leaving quite a lot behind, is whilst if you did a forage analysis on that whole sort of wildflower meadow crop, it might not come up as well as, say, a ryegrass clover lay, but actually what they've eaten is the best because they're selective grazers and they'll take the best. And so you'll actually get quite good gains. So our average daily live weight gain of 0.8 kilos per day, that was in a situation where they were outwintered with no hay. And so it was literally just eating the stockpile, getting moved. I think they're getting moved every day when we were doing that. And obviously the winter gains aren't as good as the summer gains. And then we also sell some of our stores to a couple of butchers who finish their own stock. And even with our native sires on fairly commercial cows, so a native Angus, smaller Angus, the old genetics, they're getting 1.5 kilos on the steers, which he was very happy with. So, you know, that's just off grass alone, and he's completely grass fed as well. So the system altogether has allowed us to expand to over 1,000 acres. We've got 44 acres of pasture available at home, and you know, and grow the pedigree side and whatever else we're doing. And a gross margin per cow. So this was, if we looked at a system of, if we're selling stores. So if we're selling stores, we wean at about 10 months. So if we're calving from early May, we're weaning from sort of early mid-March, hopefully weaning onto growing grass where we are. And just when, you know, the folks around us who are finishers have got plenty of grass to turn cattle out to. And, you know, for that sort of rising to yearling cattle, you get quite a good price for us with the Aberdeen Angus as well as a bit of a premium. So that's the gross margin, net cash profit or net profit of £300 per cow on that sort of system. And then in terms of stocking rate, I'll talk a little bit later about how we sort of can manipulate stocking rate depending on what requirements you've got. You know, obviously if you've got more rent, you're probably going to have to need more revenue, higher rent, you'll need more revenue in the system, and you might need to run a higher stocking rate. And there are ways of doing that to make that work. But we look at the AHDB figures of the national average stocking rate for suckler herds, which is about 0.6 to 0.8 cows per acre. So not quite a cow per acre. So we managed to get up to that, and we could run it at that if we wanted. So then if we look at, in terms of the cattle choice that we make, size of cow is relevant because it's your energy requirements are are a function of how big the cow is and how much food she needs to eat. You know, it's approximately somewhere near 3% of her body weight a day in dry matter that she's going to need. So there's a lot of difference in that. And the thing is, fertility. If we look at essentially, fertility is the number one profit predictor in suckler cows. So every bit of research I've ever seen has shown that that's far more important than how big the calves grow or anything like that. It's all about fertility. How many calves you get, and if we're looking at this, you know, you can feed those 900 kilo cows so that you're going to get this up to 95 out of 100. But the reality, in my experience, has been that if you're running them in a limited environment, so it's just what the land can provide, then you just can't get there with those big cows, and you just don't get the return for having those bigger cows, in my experience, and you can't make up for that in the additional growth on the calves. Essentially, you want as many marketable calves as possible. And we're now in a situation in the industry where, I don't know if it's the same up here, but dead weight, anything over 400 kilos, the abattoirs are not that interested in anymore, and they're deducting on that basis. So I don't think we need to even look at growth in terms of the national herd that we've got at the moment. We've got plenty of growth in our cattle. What we need is more fertility. So we don't want extreme growth, and this idea. You know, there are people who do the numbers game very well, and they look at their herd as a population and look at the progress the herd makes. But this idea of an individual animal at sort of top 1% of the herd, or top 1% of the breed, or top 5% of the breed in growth rates, that's not, I don't think that's relevant. If we look at individual animals, what you want is consistency, and I think that's the thing to use the numbers for. That's just my opinion. We do have customers who come into us specifically because they've been keeping replacements from these really growthy bulls, and they're just finding that the cows are too expensive to keep, so they wanted to make their cows smaller, and then they can use, and then down the line what will end up is they'll use our bulls for a few years, and then as a rule might use one of those growthy bulls as a terminal sire, but then keep females out of the more maternal bulls that we sell, or other people do sell them as well. I aim for our smallest heifers to finish at 275 kilos dead weight off grass by 24 months to avoid the penalties, so that all your calves are marketable. And so I want cows basically as small as I can get to deliver that for the bull customers. And we're sort of chopping and changing about where that ideal is, but it's somewhere between 550, 650 kilos for us. So, and I think it's worth looking at, if we look at the national figures, the national calving interval, compared to world averages, we're really bad as an industry, as a nation. You look at New Zealand, it's I think it's like 370, 380. And so if you think about that as an average, that means half the cattle were worse than 420-day calving interval. You know, that's just not a profitable business. And I think that's one of the things, if we're going to be without subsidy, propping up our sector in the future, then the cows have just got to pay for themselves. It's just what it is, and we need to get that down as much as we can. Keeping it simple. If she rears a calf every year, trouble-free, holds condition and breeds back on time, then she's all right. You know, people often ask. We'll talk a little bit about physiological selection, looking at phenotype for fertility, but it's, people ask, which heifers are the fertile ones, or which are your good heifers, and once they've done that, so once she's got in calf, had a calf on her own, held condition, she's bred back on time, I know a lot more about which are my best heifers. So just, we can all think we know, but actually sometimes you get one that doesn't fit the type, but if she's correct in feet and legs and udder, and she does that, then she's pretty good. Someone's mentioned that we should look at foot EBVs. Since keeping cattle completely outside after a couple of years of culling maybe a few more, 3 or 4 animals, we just haven't had a problem. I think the environment then sorts that out. Seems to be like a reaction to the environment. I think they call it epigenetics, and that seems to solve any foot issues. And the other thing is structure. So you see a lot of issues with structure. If you look at some of the really high growth bulls that we have in some of the breeds, nearly all of them are post-legged, and that has all sorts of implications for the females in terms of proper hip structure for calving, but it also having not correct structure, so not having the even angles from hook to pin to stifle to hock to down to your pasterns. That if you don't have those even angles, then that's going to lead to more foot problems. And I think maybe with focus on numbers, we've maybe let a little bit go on our conformation. So having straight moving cattle, with proper angles on the joints is a big thing. Good shoulder slope, correct shoulder slope, and that. So some of our selection perhaps hasn't helped us. So there's some breeds. So Shoshone, so Larry Leonard in North America, he's dead now, but still the Shoshone Angus are sort of through probably 5 or 6 herds over there, which has been bred entirely. He was a very successful pedigree breeder who then went down a different route of having terminal line, maternal line, and then he had a mixture. He got rid of the two. He got rid of everything but his maternal line in the end, and then just bred that pure. Stopped registering, and then the American Angus Association said he could just keep everything registered because it was one population. But it got so close bred that they couldn't, at that time, they couldn't identify by DNA which were who was whose, because he was running multiple bulls with the cows. Native Angus, we found the Native Angus actually to be really fertile. They're a smaller cow. There's some very different lines within them, as some of you will be aware of the belt buckle cattle from the sort of 60s, and some of those lines are available. We try and avoid those if we can. There's particular lines, some of you might know some of them, like the Evesham and Duplin lines we really like. They seem to be really fertile, and I understand from Geordie Souter that he was known as the great fixer of udders, which is a great nickname to have for a male. But we've certainly found that I've got two half-brothers you saw earlier. They're both line bred to him. He's in 4 times in their pedigree, and he will, if you've got, a couple of the cows we brought in had some fairly big teats on them, but one cross and it's very neat udder on them. And we do find that. And I think it's interesting as well, this is anecdotal, can't prove any of this, but is that if you've got a really neat, even, tidy udder, then that often links to fertility. And I think it's just one of those things that, just correct structure is something that the old cowman would always do. But that seems to actually pay dividends, I think. So with all this sort of, you might be looking for longevity, but then we've also got to consider, it's a good question people have asked before, is about cow depreciation. Some people put a set year and think you should get rid of cows at about 8 years old. I think for me it's just a case of you've got to look at depreciation on paper versus real depreciation. So I think there's an element of just using your judgment as a stockman or stockwoman as to when this cow's going to come out of production. You start seeing them lose condition is rather than put an age on it. Because if you get some cows breeding through to their 20s, then you're going to want them in the herd for as long as possible so that their genetic impact as great as possible. And there are some great herds that in this country, Angus herds. I know a couple actually that they almost ruthlessly cull at about 8 or 9, I think they're missing something there when they've got perhaps some really good cows that could come through. 10 minutes, that's fine. And then Old Granny, who was the first cow in the Angus herd book. Someone might be able to help me when the date was. Is that 1887? I think, something like that. But she was, that's her, or an artist's impression. I think she was 33 when she died, but she brought, maybe they should have culled her a bit earlier looking at her, but I think she brought a calf from 2-year-old every year till she was 27, and so that's why she goes in the herd book at the start. So I just wonder, with all our progress, how much we've come forward since over 100 years ago. How much progress have we actually made? Because I think we'd all like a few of them that are bringing that many calves for us. So that is, I'm going to have to come this way a bit to see. So that's 634, so she's one of mine. And I just put that up there because it's a nice phenotype. That's in a ryegrass, one of the few ryegrass fields we've got. But there's a cattle scientist called Jan Bonsma, which some of you may have come across. He's a South African guy, I think it was Stellenbosch University. The university had extensive cattle ranches over there, and he looked at 40,000 cows and then looked at the physiological development, the phenotype of all of them, and then marked different sort of skeletal structures, and then looked at the fertility record of every cow, and then tried to, basically his idea was he wanted something simple that farmers could just go and choose a phenotype for fertility that was going to be a quicker process than waiting until finding out which cow's bred for 15 years, which is a bit of a longer process. And it was something that practical that farmers could do from a phenotype point of view, just from what they look like. And so there's certain skeletal characteristics that you would look for. Now, if I was to criticise her, she's got a slightly high tail head, but she has got a really nice slope from hook to pin. So that works, that's nice. And in terms of her calving, obviously easily with the down slope, but also with, with her being able to drain properly from when she's cleansing, or if there's an infection, or if any damage or anything, or just a liquid to come out. People breeding this for the higher pins, which because they're breeding for a top line for the show ring, potentially has quite a negative impact on proper hip structure for calving and actually actual cow health. She's got quite a nice amount of capacity. She's got some good length, which you can just about see, I think, from there. And she's got a real open heart room between her legs, so lots of space between her legs. So even though she's got quite a feminine shoulder, she's actually got loads of heart room. So her vital organ capacity, there's loads of space for those organs. So in a bit like sort of Steve Redgrave's got twice the size lungs as a normal human. Similarly, if we've got more vital organ capacity, then that's something, then their everyday life. You go and watch them in hot weather, and you'll see which ones have got the biggest energy requirements. Because the ones like I go and look at her, and she's just quite happy. She might even be grazing, whereas the ones that are breathing heavy under a tree, that they're struggling, because their metabolic efficiency isn't as good. So. Then we're looking at skeletal structure. So one of the things that happens if you select for growth rates. What are we selecting for if we select for growth?
One that puts on most kilos a day.
Pardon?
The one that puts on most kilos a day.
Most kilos a day. Yeah. So more meat. So, but in terms of the animal, what are we actually selecting for? What's going to change? Hungriest. Maybe, yeah, possibly. I think it's a good point. There's so many things we could be selecting for. So it could be efficiency of the rumen. It could be, like you say, that Andre Vauzan, who mentioned earlier, did a study on cow grazing, and within one herd of fairly well-related dairy cows, of about, I think there were about 150 cows in the herd, some would have a maximum number of daily bites of 5,500, and the top performer was 9,000 bites. So you look at, and he thought they were grazing to exhaustion every day, so that had a relevance, in terms of their metabolic efficiency as well. But the other thing you're potentially selecting for is the hormone balance, because hormone balance dictates growth rates. And so what you tend to find is this has an impact on skeletal development, and you can see this in the females in terms of in a natural hormonally balanced animal, your growth hormones and the reproductive hormones are sort of almost competing. And then when it gets to a certain age and it reaches sexual maturity, that happens because the reproductive hormones then overtake the growth hormones, and at that point, the growth plates on the long bones will close when that hormone balance happens. And then that means that you then get the secondary sexual characteristics coming in, so the hip development, the proper pelvic development for calving, and the sort of the dropping down of the udder. The heifers start to look just a little bit more like a cow, don't they? And the bulls will get that thoracic extension and start putting on that a little bit more bull mass. And they'll be wedged the opposite way to the cow. But the other thing you'll see is, with the long bones not growing for as long, is sometimes in the high growth cattle, well, nearly always in the high growth cattle, you'll notice that the cows will have a pronounced crest, and you won't have this dip on the shoulder blade here as much. So when the cow's walking, you should see that shoulder blade rotating above the chine bone that runs across the top of the spine. Because if they've got that higher growth rate, and that was one of the key things that Bonsma selected, was if that growth hormones carried on above the reproductive hormones too long, then that chine bone keeps growing, and it'll grow above the shoulder. So just by seeing and selecting those heifers or the cows over time, what I try and do is select a little bit on phenotype, but also on performance. So if something looks wrong, but keeps bringing a calf every year, she could be inherently fertile, so she can stop. But over time. But it's just something to add to your repertoire. And I think selecting on data is important, but I think also selecting on phenotype, just as the old cowmen, cowwomen would have done in the past. Tidy little udder. So that that will have been. She'll have calved within a day or two when I took that picture. So you've got a fertile cow with a nice big calf. That's weaning at about 10 months, so Weaning percentage is pretty good, but obviously it's an older calf. And then in terms of cattle selection, we've got that thoracic development, and we found these two bulls have both been really fertile for us. We had him collected this year, and actually the UK Sire Services phoned us up. They told us to expect 150 to 350 straws per jump. And after the third week, they phoned up and said, look, this has happened before, but it doesn't happen often. But he did 1,100 straws on one jump, and he did that 3 times over the time he was there. And we found, like, his heifers last year, we put them back to him actually for their first calf. So we put him back on his daughters, but they were calves, 100% in calf, 90% were first cycle. And I think fertility in the cow, fertility in the bull, a bit like that, tidy udder seems to lead to a good structure in the rest of the animal as well. These sort of things run through. And then this year, lucky enough to be offered a Nuffield Scholarship, looking at evaluation of selection methods in beef cattle for profitability in grass-fed systems, bit of a mouthful. So travelling around and meeting there's some really interesting people doing some stuff in different places in the world, and that's why actually I'm up in Scotland, because there's some interesting folk up here I want to meet. And so, they're looking at estimated breeding values, but there's lots of other things that people are talking about in terms of selection, and it's just want to cover off, whether it's New Zealand, Argentina just being absolutely ruthless, no calf, she's gone, and that's been the case for a long time. Linear measurement, which is more like a bit of voodoo with a tape measure. I'm not quite sure about that. I'll try and keep an open mind. The show and the sale ring impact, that does have an impact on phenotype, and maybe we need to think a bit more carefully about that. And I'm also a bit worried about the future with regards to genomics, because people think, I've got a genomic value that tells me that this is a fertile cow, well, that's a productive cow. But the reality is that a lot of the data for actually saying that we've identified this gene, a lot of the data comes from EBVs, and some people will disagree with me, but the accuracy of some of that data is quite questionable. And I think but the trouble is when people hear this sort of technology and it's science, so it's right. And I think if we're not careful and we don't select on other practical things, then we could end up going down some, narrowing our gene pool and going down some blind alleys if we're not careful. And then I think I've got like 2 minutes. Yeah, hurry up, Rob. So just to say, so that's some of the cattle selection stuff that we do and we're working towards. Certainly haven't perfected it, but that's what we're doing. Some of the diversity, that was just to show for Cairngorms folk the late flowering. So that's from a summer grazing, and then this was taken, I think, in October. But you've still got loads of flowering plants coming up even then. And then by skim grazing across the platform all year, we're leaving as much grass as we can behind, and we'll set bales across, and then we'll roll them out. Heron comes in for a bit of protection, and they'll eat the voles as well, and the frogs. Roll the bales out, and then that's someone in a bit more similar climate to here, so it's a friend of mine in Canada, who they put those out, and they've got cattle out on those bale pods at sort of minus 40 degrees centigrade. It's absolutely crazy. But it's interesting that, the cows are actually using calories up to cool themselves down until it gets to about minus 20. So in terms of welfare, and he's very strict on his culling, so they've all got to bring a calf, so they've got to live within that environment. And the key thing with that is that this is our bale pod at home, one of the farms, and then that was it while we were using it. I think there was about 87 cows and their calves. That might have just been after there's a few calves in there. So that there's about 87 in that group. So we just let them at the bales. They waste a fair bit, but my goodness, don't you get some growth the following year? And when we're looking at this, so we use this bale pod here as a way of, when we're grazing around the platform, if we get a significant amount of snow where they just can't get to the grass, or if it's really, really wet, we've got this as kind of a sacrifice area. You can also use it, you're going to have a limited amount of stockpile, and with your bale rolling a certain amount of bales you can put out across your grazing platform without damaging it. And so that's going to give you a maximum stocking rate for the whole farm if you're going to follow this system. But if you need to increase it because you've got higher rent levels or whatever reason, we actually, with the pedigree side of it, it does give us a boost on the income side, so it justifies us having more cattle than we do at the moment. But that would then not be the same system as, you know, that we'd be running. But the point being is it's a cost-benefit analysis on how many extra bales you feed in this way and how many days extra feeding you have to do, because the more cattle you have, the more time they're going to be spending in one of these. And it's just literally a marginal reaction type gross profit analysis that you just need to do to see how that works, and it'll be different on every farm. So advantages, loads of wildlife advantages. Wintering costs are massive. That's one of your biggest costs in the business. If you don't, you know, and the good thing is when the bales are all set out and we get that all done by sort of October time, then I effectively, let's say we had, I can feed the cows, I can feed 150 cows just by going out, rolling bales out. I suppose I could, if we had another fuel crisis and we didn't have diesel for a month, I could go on my bike, I could still roll them all out and feed the cows. But I think if you think about, you know, that when we had that fuel shortage not long ago, that really made me think, like, crikey, what would happen if we had that in winter and I couldn't fill the tractor with diesel? You know, it's something to think about. So having your food in the field ready, even if it's with kale or whatever it is, it's not a bad idea, I don't think. Very low fixed costs, new entrants. Yeah, talked about some of that. And I think it's helped us move forward and grow the business with the holistic management side of things. And I think, you know, I grew up on a family farm where the costs are always, you know, talk around a dinner table, costs are always too high, the prices are always too low, the industries, where's it going? It wasn't positive for me growing up to think, oh, I really want to be a farmer. But actually, you know, when we can see the environmental benefits that you see on the farm, and then you see the cattle going well, and the kids are getting involved, and it's a different sort of narrative even in the family home. It's a more positive thing, and I think, and that's been really good for us personally. So let's go to questions. Sorry, I've prattled on too long. But I think just have a think about this. You know, we've got to relook at what we're doing. You know, because otherwise we could be in trouble. There you go. Thank you.